his 3 days, mostly just to show me up with his abundance of handouts to my complete lack of handouts. So if you missed handouts from Monday or Tuesday or yesterday, they are here. There's my mom. Hi, Mom. Thanks for my wife. Okay. It's Friday, so this is the end. So hopefully there'll be some extra time at the end for questions, comments about anything all week. And I'm sure that Rob still remembers everything he taught. Yeah, he's good. He's good to go, so he can respond to anything. When I got here last Saturday, I wasn't completely settled on what my second session was going to be. I was still bouncing around in my head. And I hadn't really started thinking about it at all because I hadn't quite put together my first session. And I knew that one was coming first. So I got that one done, and then I jumped into the second one, and I wait, what's my, and you're always looking for like, what's my angle? What's the thought that will carry me through all of this? I finally came up with that thought the night before last. So I finished putting together these slides at about 2:30 this morning. So I'm a little sleepy. And as we get near the end of the presentation, I'm not exactly sure what is in the slides. So it's pictures of my family pop up, or our vacation. This, I'll try to work that into the talk somehow. Thanks for coming back. Let me get started. Let me open in prayer. Lord, thank you for this week. Thank you so much for a gathering of your followers, of like-minded people, with the interest in wrestling with difficult issues. Thank you for our mental faculty to wrestle with these issues, and thank you for a God-given heart of love, to love the people on the other side of the issues. Help us to show that love even while we're using our mental faculties to wrestle with these issues, to not give up our principles, but at the same time to love our neighbors. And just guide our conversation today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
And silence ourselves. I heard that. Hey, thank you. That's my wife. Thank you, wife. So to get me through this, another thing you know of me, I'm extremely introverted. And most people say, no, you're not, you're up in front. Introverts can walk up in front. It just means when you're done, you go lie down, because you've used all your energy for the day. So because this is a 90-minute thing, and I don't usually do 90-minute things, I'm not a college professor, I do like chapel talks. So I went over and I got a donut, and I crammed the donut like 10 minutes ago. And now I'm just on a sugar buzz. And I figure that should make it at least 45 minutes. So if I run out to grab another donut, that means I've lost my sugar rush. Sometimes you wake up and you're disoriented. And there's if you wake up and you don't know what's going on, there's 2 really important questions to ask. The first one is, where am I? The second one is, how did I get here? If you don't like where you are, it helps to know how you got there, so that you can either retrace your steps or at least avoid doing the same thing again and ending up in the same place. We need to know where we are, and I love to ask the question, how did we get here? So as I'm looking at the topic of faith and science, sometimes where you are is because, the culture did this to me. The culture, has turned on me. The culture has put me in this box. Sometimes where you are is because of you. And you say, okay, how did I get me here? And then how do I get me somewhere else? And maybe you decide, actually, I like where this is. I like where I've got myself. It's still good to know where you are and how you got there. So I am going to tell you a story. I'm more of a storyteller than a professor. I'm going to tell you a story of where I think we are and how I think we got here. And where we are, first of all, let me put it this way. Who's this guy? Charles Darwin. Oh wait, I need my notes. See, this is going well already. In 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. He had been jaunting about the Galapagos Islands as a botanist and noticed some interesting things about the beaks of finches and how they were different shapes on different islands from eating different food, and they had actually in some cases become virtually different species of finch, and he put together this kind of theory, and then he published it. And in general, I mean, right now we think, wow, the world radically changed the day after he did that. In general, not a lot of, paleontologists noticed, actually some of the first critics were paleontologists who said, you're a botanist, we look at bones every day, we don't see what you see. Not that many clergy got all that bent out of shape. Many clergy actually said, oh, so maybe that's how God did it, and kind of went back to their business. In 2016, we had 16 candidates running for the Republican presidential nomination. All of them said either they did not believe Darwin's theory of evolution or they refused to comment on whether or not they believed Darwin's theory of evolution. When asked whether they thought the Earth was billions of years old or thousands of years old, all but one pled the fifth. So, the Earth being billions of years old and Darwinian evolution as a basic framework of biology have been in our textbooks in every age grade for more than 100 years. So how is it that in 2016, if you run for president as a Republican, you have to plead the fifth on that subject? How did we get there? That's what I'm curious about. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm curious. No presidential candidates were confused about the age of the Earth or pleading the fifth on the age of the Earth 100 years ago. Very few clergy were confused about the age of the Earth 100 years ago. This is the story I want to tell you. In fact, the only the guy on the end, Chris Christie, these guys, they went to Harvard, they went to Yale, they went to Princeton. I'm pretty sure they were taught the theory of evolution. I'm pretty sure they were taught how old the Earth is from the current scientific consensus. When Chris Christie was asked if the Earth was very old or very young, his response was, none of your business. In fact, this is a picture of him actually saying it here. That was the reporter asking him the question. The reporter was a Cubs fan, apparently, and that's him saying, if you ask me that question, I'm going to put my nachos on your head. The irony is, who's this? Okay, Billy Graham established that a few days ago. He has never had an issue with Darwinian evolution. He's never taken a position against evolution. He is, many would say, the single most prominent evangelical Christian in Western history. He has never had an issue with the Earth being very, very old. His alma mater, this is Wheaton College. Oh, I should have. John, what's that?
I think it's Wheaton College.
Okay, thanks, John. Wheaton College has never had a problem with Darwinian evolution. Wheaton College has never had a problem with the Earth being very, very old. Wheaton College is possibly the most influential school in evangelical Christianity for the last 100 years. So how do we get to a point where the most prominent evangelical personality and the most prominent evangelical school have no problem with something that every Republican presidential candidate has a problem with? Why do all these guys not want to say what they believe about evolution or the age of the earth? Because they want the evangelical vote. And they've been told that you can't get the evangelical vote if you believe in Darwinian evolution or if you believe the earth is billions of years old. So what I'm curious is, how did we get there? That's what I'm curious about. Let's go back to this guy. When he came out with his theory, like I said, it wasn't a huge deal for most clergy, especially in England. There was a debate. T.H. Huxley, it's called Darwin's Bulldog, and he debated to defend this idea, primarily against people who were arguing not from the Bible, but from paleontology, who were arguing that, yes, but we see new species pop up in the fossil record fully formed. You know, where's all the tiny little increments between one species and the other? And Darwin acknowledged that, yeah, that's, you know, I'm hoping that those would pop up eventually, but that is an issue. Most clergy, especially in America, didn't really notice this, didn't really care that much because something else had their attention. And the thing that really had their attention at roughly the same time was how the Bible was being critiqued, how people were viewing the Bible differently. This is that Tübingen? Tübingen? Thank you. It's hard to get the pronunciations when you're researching things online. I'm not German. Tübingen University in Germany is one of the epicenters of what you call higher criticism of the Bible, historical criticism of the Bible. Everybody who studied the Bible up until the late 18th to early 19th century, everyone who studied the Bible started with the assumption that it was what it said it was. That this is Holy Scripture. That if it says, I, Paul, write this letter, it means Paul wrote that letter. If we say Moses wrote this stuff, it means Moses wrote this stuff. Almost everyone who studied the Bible started with the assumption that it was what it said it was. Starting in the late 18th century, early 19th century, a new school of biblical criticism emerged that said, wait a minute, shouldn't we study this book just like we study any other book? Why do we put this in a special place? Why do we assume it is what it says it is? Let's study it starting with the assumption that it isn't what it says it is, and then see how much evidence we find for that. And suddenly, it was really born in Germany in the mid-19th century, theologians started throwing out all sorts of things. It's like, come on, the virgin birth, that's got to be something they made up. Come on, the feeding 5,000, walking on water. You know, these are things that were probably added or probably just made up. And more and more of these supernatural assumptions about the Bible started to get thrown away in this school of thought. This initially caused a stir in Germany, spread around Europe. Took a long time to get to America. We had this ocean, you know, to get ideas to get over. But eventually it landed in the U.S. at Princeton Theological Seminary, which is the head seminary at the time for the Presbyterian Church. This caused a huge issue within the Presbyterian Church initially, where people tried to say, we have to modernize how we view the Bible. We have to modernize Christianity. Are we really going to hold to these, you know, medieval or ancient Iron Age beliefs in a world, reading from one theologian, said flat out, how can we believe in a virgin birth in an age of electric light? Because we have electric light bulbs. How could there have been a virgin birth? I'm not sure I see the connection. I mean, 500 years ago, you could have said, how could we believe in the virgin birth in the age of the printing press? 1,000 years ago, you could have said, how can we believe in the virgin birth in the age of the shovel? You know, just because we have a new tool doesn't fundamentally change anything. But the spirit of the age of the 19th century was so wrapped up in progress and a new technological dawn that even among theologians, there was a desire to distance yourself from a superstitious past. So we had literally had Christian theologians saying, now of course most of this stuff didn't really happen, but it's the teaching that this is about. So this landed at the U.S. in Princeton Theological Seminary. There was a great schism within Presbyterianism, and then ideas started spreading into other denominations, which led to controversies over how to interpret the Bible, and what ended up being called modernism. Are we adapting a modernist view of Scripture through pretty much every denomination in America? This is why we weren't paying much attention to Darwin, because we were much more concerned about losing the Bible and supernaturalism, the belief in God and miracles, than we were about what Finch's beaks told us about species. People in America got very, very concerned about what was happening in seminaries. This is Lyman Stewart. He founded the Union Oil Company, wealthy guy. He used that money to start the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, which is now known as Biola University. He was very concerned about these modernist views of the Bible and what they were doing to American Christianity. So he took some money and he got two guys, these two guys, A.C. Dixon and R.H. I just got to tell you, people really used to look classy. Like, all these guys, these are classy looking guys. Does anyone look like that anymore? I don't think we look classy anymore. Anyway, Lyman Stewart funded A.C. Dixon and R.A. Torrey. He said, we have to reclaim what is true about Christianity. We have to define, we have to put stakes in the ground saying, this is historical Christianity, and we will not yield on these points. So they produced a series of pamphlets that they called the Fundamentals. In between 1910 and 1915, Lyman Stewart funded them. Those other two guys edited them. 90 essays from different pastors who were committed to historical Christianity on every possible topic. Supernaturalism, miracles, the Holy Spirit. This was a fence built to keep out the modernists. Because they called these papers the fundamentals, the people who ascribed to them were soon called fundamentalists. And this led to the modernist fundamentalist controversy, which included fun cartoons like this one. This is the Descent of the Modernists. And you'll notice that that nice young man with a bright future starts at the top at Christianity, and then he takes a step and says the Bible is not infallible, and then he takes another step and says man is not made in God's image. Then he says no miracles, no virgin birth, no deity, no atonement, no resurrection, agnosticism, atheism. So there was a war, a major war within Christianity. And that was the slippery slope. If you give an inch, the world is going to be atheist. This is what everybody was thinking about in the teens. And then something happened in Tennessee. That's where it all started. This is John Washington Butler. He was a farmer in Tennessee. In early 1920s, he lobbied the Tennessee legislature to outlaw the teaching of evolution. When asked later, John Washington Butler, farmer, said, I didn't know anything. I have a lot of friends in Tennessee, so I have to talk like them when I do them. I didn't know anything about evolution. I read in the papers that boys and girls were coming home from school and telling their fathers and mothers that the Bible was all nonsense. So there was a story that he had heard from friends that evolution being taught in schools was convincing kids to give up on the Bible. Now the same in the current of this, there was now this new threat. Wait a minute, evolution is doing the same thing. It's taking people down that slippery slope from Christianity to atheism. So John Washington Butler campaigned the Tennessee legislature to outlaw the teaching of evolution. The governor, who really didn't care one way or another, decided to support the law because he wanted and needed more support from rural legislators. So he supported the law, and it got passed, and the teaching of evolution in the state of Tennessee officially became illegal. Now this was kind of funny, because at the time, the textbook that all teachers were required to use in the state of Tennessee had a chapter on evolution. So technically, every teacher in Tennessee was breaking this law every year already. The ACLU offered to defend anyone accused of breaking the law. Several businessmen in Dayton, Tennessee, decided that having the trial of teaching evolution would be wonderful for the economy of a small town. They needed a volunteer. A guy named John Scopes stepped forward. He was a substitute teacher. He had substituted in biology. He wasn't convinced he had ever actually mentioned evolution, but he was willing to be the test subject. Because he taught from the standard textbook, he figured, well, surely I mentioned it at some point. This was the textbook, Hunter's Civic Biology, 1914. So since 1914, Darwinian evolution had been in textbooks, in the textbook used by the entire state of Tennessee. Now people got excited. We're going to have a trial over evolution. Both sides decided they needed to get the most prominent lawyers that they could find to win this case. Now remember, when we talk about atheism, remember a few days ago, remember there were more atheists in America in 1920 than in 1970. So it's not like atheism hadn't been invented yet. Many intellectuals in the US were already agnostics or atheists. And the notion of this trial caught everybody's attention. So, two of the most famous lawyers in the country agreed to take up the case. William Jennings Bryan, who had run for US president 3 times, was one of the driving forces behind the passing of Prohibition. A strong, conservative, fundamentalist Christian, a devout Presbyterian, agreed to prosecute the case to prove that John Scopes had taught. Now the funny thing was, the actual case was just over whether he had broken the law, which was kind of obviously true, because he taught evolution. But that's not what the sides wanted to try. They really wanted to put evolution on trial, not John Scopes on trial. Clarence Darrow, one of America's most famous lawyers and an agnostic, initially said, I don't want to be the defense because my presence will turn the trial into a circus. He then realized that the trial was already headed into circus territory, regardless of whether he got involved, and he changed his position. Thousands of people descended on Dayton, Tennessee. The Anti-Evolution League promoted the conflict. It says, hell in the high school. They sold William Jennings Bryan's books. It was a circus. There were newspaper stories like this, that the jury box filled with monkeys worried about their fate. This is one of John Scopes' students, a 14-year-old boy, under testimony as to whether he heard John Scopes teach evolution. So they'd all know for sure. Most of the kids couldn't remember anything, and John Scopes himself wasn't actually sure he ever did teach evolution, so the kids had to be fed phrases to say so that they could get the case, so the case could be tried. They had to prove. Local businessmen loved it. The local drugstore owner bought himself a chimpanzee, dressed it in a suit, named it Joe Mendy, I have no idea why, and had it sit in his drugstore every day for the tourists that were coming to town for the monkey trials. So every day this little monkey performed for the trial in a drugstore. There were banners hung across Main Street about the monkey trials. There were posters of monkeys in store windows. The case ended up becoming so big that they wouldn't fit in the courthouse. Cracks started appearing in the courthouse walls from the number of people inside, so they moved it outside. And thousands of people listening to the case. This was the first American trial to be carried live on the radio nationwide. The defense argued that the trial was raising the specter of inquisitions and that the Bible should be preserved in the realm of theology and morality and not put into a course of science. On the seventh day of the trial, Clarence Darrow, arguing for the defense, made the unusual move of calling William Jennings Bryan to testify, the opposing lawyer. He called him to the stand to testify as an expert on the Bible. Darrow had questions prepared beforehand by a modernist minister to try to catch fundamentalist Bryan. Darrow asked if Bryan really believed Eve was created from Adam's rib. Asked where Cain found his wife. Asked how many Israelites could have possibly lived in ancient Egypt. When the judge interrupted to ask what purpose this line of questioning served, Bryan, the guy being asked all these questions, William Jennings Bryan, remarked sharply that the purpose seems to have been to cast ridicule on everybody who believes the Bible. Clarence Darrow sharply responded, "We have the purpose of preventing bigots and ignoramuses from controlling the education of the United States." After one more angry exchange between the two men, the judge banged his gavel and adjourned the court. The trial, which had started out as little more than a publicity stunt for the town of Dayton, Tennessee, turned into a national referendum on the modernist fundamentalist debate about the Bible and its role in society. The front pages of newspapers like the New York Times were dominated by the case for days. This was the O.J. trial of its day. More than 200 newspaper reporters from all parts of the country and 2 from London were in Dayton, Tennessee. 22 telegraph operators sent out 165,000 words per day on the trial. Over thousands of miles of telegraph wires hung just for that purpose. More words were transmitted to Britain about the Scopes trial than for any previous American event. Trained chimpanzees performed in the courthouse lawn. Chicago's WGN radio station broadcast the trial live, first time ever. 2 movie cameramen had their film flown out daily in a small plane from a specially prepared airstrip. They built an airport for this trial. Baltimore Sun reporter H.L. Mencken, an agnostic, famously mocked the town's inhabitants as yokels and morons. He called Bryan a buffoon and his speeches theologic bilge. In contrast, he called the defense eloquent and magnificent. The media's portrayal of Darrow's cross-examination of Bryan and the play and the movie Inherit the Wind about the event released in 1960 caused millions of Americans to ridicule religious-based opposition to the theory of evolution. In the end, Bryan won the case. The teacher had obviously broken the law, regardless of whether or not Eve was made from Adam's literal rib. But in the aftermath, everything changed. 5 days after the trial, William Jennings Bryan died. It's still debated whether it was because of the stress of the trial or completely unrelated. And the fundamentalist side, since the days of fighting for prohibition, he had been the most vocal statesman for fundamentalist Christianity, the most famous, the most outspoken, and the most respected. Fundamentalist Christianity lost its most eloquent and famous spokesman. Damage had been done to the fundamentalist ego. One commentator said, the trial would eventually become symbolic in American culture for fundamentalism's mean-spirited anti-intellectualism and even buffoonery. This is the poster for the 1960 movie with Spencer Tracy playing William Jennings, or playing Clarence Darrow. Bob Jones Sr., founder of Bob Jones University and one of the central figures of American fundamentalism, recalled, there's Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan again, recalled that in 1924, so just a year before the trial, he was sitting at a Bible conference in Winona Lake, Indiana, next to William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan said, if schools and colleges do not quit teaching evolution as a fact, we are going to become a nation of atheists. Bob Jones, who himself was not a college graduate, grew determined to found a college. And on September 12, 1927, just 2 years after the Scopes trial, he opened Bob Jones College. Fundamentalist Christians pulled back from secular academia and began founding their own schools where they could teach what they wanted the way they wanted. Now, interestingly, as we look at atheism and Christianity in England, the same thing did not happen there, which is why you still find conservative Christian scholars in places like Oxford and Cambridge. You're much less likely to find that in the U.S. because we pulled back and made all of our own schools. As this went on, a drift began to widen even further between modernist Christianity and fundamentalist Christianity. And some fundamentalist Christians became concerned that the drift was modernist Christians, today you might refer to them as mainline Protestants for the most part, were drifting into anti-supernaturalism, giving up on the notion of God and miracles, while fundamentalist Christians were drifting into anti-intellectualism, giving up on the life of the mind to hold on to the rigors of the Bible. There were also concerns that fundamentalists were becoming so concerned with policing belief within their ranks. Remember the staircase, all the different stairs that you could take to move away from historical Christianity, that they had lost interest in evangelism. That the focus of too much of their time was simply on making sure everyone in their tent was believing what they were supposed to believe. The impact of the modernist controversy was huge on American Christianity. So as modernist Christianity wandered away from supernaturalism, many worried that fundamentalist Christianity was wandering away from intellectual engagement, wandering away from the life of the mind. In 1941, Harold John Ockenga, that makes sense. Pastor of Park Street Church in Boston issued a call for a new Christian movement, something that he called neo-evangelicalism. And that year, the National Association of Evangelicals was born. He felt that if modernists were drifting away from supernaturalism and fundamentalists were drifting away from the life of the mind, we needed something in the middle. And that something in the middle he called neo-evangelical. In 1947, Ockenga co-founded Fuller Theological Seminary with Charles E. Fuller. The initial faculty, which included Carl Henry, were evangelical intellectuals who wanted to write a new chapter in Christian higher education. In 1956, remember this guy? Billy Graham and Carl Henry, the guy who helped found Fuller Seminary, launched Christianity Today magazine, the mouthpiece of the middle way, of neo-evangelicalism. Graham reaches out to other denominations to join in his big city crusades, even modernist denominations. In 1957, Bob Jones announces that he can no longer associate with Billy Graham because Billy Graham is willing to associate with modernists. Evangelicals and fundamentalists drift further apart. At this point, it looks something like this. Fundamentalists go to Bob Jones University. Modernists go to Princeton Theological Seminary. Evangelicals go to Wheaton College. There were three streams of American Christianity. The three strains continue in the realm of science. Modernists have no problem whatsoever with evolution, even in its extreme form that leaves little room for God. Fundamentalists reject evolution entirely. None of it. Not a bit of it. Neo-evangelicals like Graham and Carl Henry and Wheaton College and Fuller Seminary kind of wrestle along in the middle, accepting the science of evolution based on the evidence, but finding a coexistence between Darwinism and God. In 1963, Wheaton College students excavate a mastodon from a judge's backyard in a nearby town. The mastodon is put on display in the science building with a plaque dating the creature to roughly 20,000 years ago during the last ice age and roughly 14,000 years before Bob Jones University teaches that the world was created. In the meantime, the same year that Inherit the Wind was released, a new book was published that would have a huge impact on conservative Christians and their views of science. The book was called The Genesis Flood by John Whitcomb and Henry Morris. This book birthed the modern young earth creationist movement, but it didn't start with this book. It actually, this is where the story gets really interesting. It actually started with this lady, Ellen White, the co-founder of Seventh-day Adventism. Is that how you say that? Adventistry? Adventism? That's it? Just Adventism. What happened to the tist? The silent? Is it a silent tist? Ellen White was a prophetess. She was a part of a movement that in 1844 believed Jesus would return. So they sold everything and they gathered around and they waited for him to return. And then he didn't come back, and some of them spun off and started a new sect within Christianity. And she was one of the leaders, and that is now Seventh-day Adventism. She wrote heavily and had visions. She was a prophetess. She had visions. She wrote down her visions. One day in 1890, she had a vision on Genesis 1, the creation account. The flood, she said, and this was from her vision, reshaped the surface of the earth and the fossils, and they now testify to this cataclysmic event. She wrote of her vision, everywhere after the flood, the Noah flood, everywhere were strewn the dead bodies of men and beasts. The Lord would not permit these remains to decompose and pollute the air. Therefore, he made of the earth a vast burial ground. A violent wind, which was caused to blow for the purpose of drying up the waters, moved the dead bodies with great force, in some instances even carrying away the tops of the mountains and heaping up trees, rocks, and earth above the bodies of the dead. At this time, immense forests were buried. These have since been changed to coal, forming the extensive coal beds that now exist and yielding large quantities of oil. What Ellen White had revealed in a vision that she had was the idea, basically, that Noah's flood created everything we see in geology. Her interpretation of the flood became widely known outside Adventist circles through the writings of George McCready Price. He was a self-taught geologist with limited education beyond high school, but he was a gifted writer, an amateur scientist, and a tireless crusader in the cause of anti-evolution. He wrote a 723-page book called The New Geology, published in 1923, taking Ellen White's vision and building it into a full alternative science of the world. The book was noticed and promoted by William Jennings Bryan. Price's thinking influenced Whitcomb and Morris as they wrote The Genesis Flood 35 years later. And suddenly, the idea of the Genesis Flood, depositing all of the fossils, carving the Grand Canyon, making everything the way it is now, went mainstream among conservative Christians. A high school boy in Australia got a copy of the Genesis Flood, and it rocked his world. He couldn't stop talking about it. He became a school teacher, but kept talking about this style of creationism, even on TV in Australia. His name was Ken Ham. In 1987, he moved to the U.S. and began touring the country, speaking in churches, distributing videos and books promoting what was now being called creation science, an alternative to mainstream science based on the writings of Whitcomb and Morris, George McCready Price, and ultimately the vision of Ellen White. Now, while all of this is happening, fun, huh? While all of this is happening, these three strains continue to move along. Modernism had abandoned supernaturality. Neo-evangelicalism was wrestling along, holding Darwinism and the Bible in tension, but holding them together. Fundamentalism had thrown out evolution entirely and was now settling in on the idea that not only was there no evolution, but that the world was created 6,000 years ago, and that everything we see in geology is based on the Genesis Flood. Now, as time goes by, modernists sort of fade into the background of American culture. Mainline Protestantism goes into steep decline. They lose their influence. The folks that ended up in the modernist camp were more progressive Christians, were very socially active. Many of them now you would find in the Democratic Party, while as most other strains of Christianity you find, say, in the Republican Party. The modernist movement in the U.S. really lost its influence as a movement. In the meantime, neo-evangelicals and fundamentalists, in some way, let's see what my next slide is, started drifting closer together. Go! Okay. Did you see that? Even overlapping in places. A new breed of what would have been called fundamentalist Christians started showing up on the scene. People like this guy. Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson. Historically, they would have been considered fundamentalists. But they were becoming politically active. And fundamentalism was viewed more and more as a Southern phenomenon, and more as an anti-intellectual phenomenon, and also kind of as a somewhat racist phenomenon, as of this time Bob Jones University still banned interracial dating on campus. So a new breed of fundamentalist Christian that was politically active, like the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons, simply referred to themselves as evangelicals. The word fundamentalist stopped being used. So by 1976, as the election of Jimmy Carter was hailed as a massive groundswell, this conservative Christian in the White House, this Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher in the White House, the story wasn't about the rise of fundamentalists, it was about the rise of the evangelicals. And everyone forgot that there had been two strains. And suddenly, it was just evangelicals. Everybody was if you believed the Bible was true, you were an evangelical. This made the market for homeschool materials, the homeschool market is exploding about the same time. Homeschooling is just going everywhere, which really came out of fundamentalist circles, which were more withdrawn from mainstream society, were more concerned about sending their kids to mainstream schools, but spread everywhere. And with that, spread the additional popularity of our buddy with the Creation Museum, who was very popular in fundamentalist circles, and then took that popularity to homeschool circles, and then took that ability to raise money to build a museum and an ark in the middle of Kentucky. With the explosive growth of homeschooling and the tireless touring of Ken Ham, Seventh-day Adventist-style creation science spread virally across the country. Ken Ham's ministry, Answers in Genesis, provided materials for homeschoolers, materials to be used in churches, materials to be used in schools. The age of the earth suddenly became a hot topic, and more Christians adopted the vision of Ellen White and the new geology of George McCready Price. With field trips to the Creation Museum in Kentucky and homeschool curriculum ordered from catalogs guaranteed to be 100% evolution-free. And thus, we end up a few years later with all of these guys determined that if you want the evangelical vote, which at this point could be defined as roughly 40% of America, because all of fundamentalism and all of evangelicalism had now been melded together in one giant statistical pot, you had to say you didn't know how old the earth was, and that you didn't have an opinion on evolution. Mainstream scientists started to notice this. Richard Dawkins, we talked about him, aggressively anti-theist, was living in the U.S. in this period of time as a visiting professor at UC Berkeley, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Americans, in his view, were losing their minds. Mainstream science, well-established science, was being thrown away and replaced with sketchy pseudoscience, in his view, on a wide scale. Was America, the world leader in science, losing its mind to religious extremists? Now remember, 9/11 is the thing that woke up guys like Richard Dawkins. It was religious extremism. Then they visited America and they saw school boards where Darwin was being thrown out of the curriculum, where creation science was being introduced as an alternative in public schools. And guys like Richard Dawkins flipped out. And suddenly, for guys like Dawkins, evangelicals, because the specific classification of fundamentalists had been lost, all evangelical Christians could be equated with radical Islamic terrorists because they're just as extreme in what they want. That Sharia law and evangelicals wanting to take over the school board were moral equivalents. What's more, Christian kids started getting really confused. At some churches, evolution was no big deal and the earth could be old. Then they would go to someone else's church and suddenly opposition to an old earth was now nearly as important as opposition to abortion or human trafficking. My kids attended Wheaton Academy. It's a private high school founded 160 years ago by the same folks who founded Wheaton College. The science teachers at Wheaton Academy for the last 20 to 30 years have taught that the earth is young and have handed out materials from Ken Ham's ministry, Answers in Genesis. Many of those kids then graduate and go to Wheaton College, where all of the science professors now teach them that the earth is old and that Darwinian evolution has a role in how God made things. This, for kids, is confusing. Especially since those two schools were founded at the same time by the same people that have the same name on them. Those kids are understandably a little confused. Wheaton College has taught very consistently that the earth is old for more than 100 years. When the new geology came into view, they simply didn't pay attention to it. Christians in the sciences are concerned. They see how confused Christian kids are. They see that kids are being forced to choose between careers in science and trust in the Bible. This is a false choice. Many of the greatest scientists in history were Christians. Copernicus, the father of heliocentrism. Galileo, the father of modern astronomy. He had a bit of a run-in with the Catholic Church, but it's not exactly as it is portrayed to be, and we could explain Galileo's run-in with the Catholic Church and why it wasn't really a war of faith versus science. Francis Bacon, the father of the scientific method. Mendel, the father of genetics. It's one of my favorites. George Lemaitre. A Catholic priest who was the first to suggest the idea of a Big Bang. And this kind of shows, his story in particular, shows how twisted or kind of convoluted the relationship between Christianity and science has gotten in the U.S. Because when I mentioned the Big Bang in one of my Christian videos for children, well, one Christian bookstore sent all the videos back, refused to sell them, because the Big Bang is what atheists believe. Okay. The Big Bang, besides being discovered by a Catholic priest, is simply the observation that the universe is expanding. And if the universe is expanding, that means at some point it was all together. And something made it go boom. Now, George Lemaitre didn't call it the Big Bang. He just said we were in an expansionist universe, and at some point it may have had a beginning. The Pope loved this idea because it sounded like Genesis 1. In the beginning, God, boom, spoke. The Pope went out and said, this proves that God made the universe. And George Lemaitre, who was on his scientific advisory council, said, don't say it. That's going too far. We don't know what was before the Big Bang, so don't use that as a proof of God. And the Pope agreed not to say anything. Before the Big Bang theory, most scientists believed in the steady state theory. They believed that the universe was eternal. Why do we not need a God? This is from an atheist point of view. Because the universe just always was. Partly, scientists opposed the Big Bang theory. In fact, the Big Bang as a name was a pejorative given to George's theory by the leading cosmologist of the day, Fred Hoyle. He was insulting it because it sounded too much like biblical creation. Okay, so how we went from there to my videos being kicked out of Christian bookstores because I mentioned a theory that sure sounds like biblical creation, this is what happened in the 20th century with the fundamentalist modernist controversy. George Lemaitre is a hero. And we got guys like we mentioned before, Francis Collins. Francis Collins is the leader of was the leader of the Human Genome Project. He's currently the director of the National Institutes of Health. He was appointed by the Obama administration and then just reappointed by the Trump administration. So he is America's leading biological scientist. He's also a devout Christian who was so concerned about the false choice being presented to Christian kids that he co-founded BioLogos Foundation, a group dedicated to unraveling the tension between science and faith. Our own resident Old Testament scholar, John Walton, in fact, has hit the road on behalf of BioLogos, touring churches, Ken Ham style, to show the errors of looking for modern science in ancient writings. There are answers in Genesis. What there isn't in Genesis is modern science. As John Walton demonstrated wonderfully in his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, Genesis was written to answer questions that the original audience would have been asking. The original audience, ancient Israelites, were not asking questions about the biological origins of humans. They were not asking questions about the age or origin of the planet we find ourselves on. They didn't know they were on a planet. The ancient Israelites wanted to know who brought order and abundance out of chaos and why. They wanted to know the story of God creating sacred space, and they wanted to know their role in that space and in that story. Those are the questions that Genesis was written to answer. So is there a conflict between faith and science today? Not really. There is a conflict, but it's not between faith and science. It's actually between naturalism and theism. The real conflict today is between naturalism and theism. Naturalism is not science. Naturalism is the belief that the natural world is all there is, that in the words of Carl Sagan, and this is how he started his Cosmos series, which was supposed to teach us science, the cosmos, this is the first line spoken in the series, at the very beginning. The cosmos is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. There is nothing except the universe. This is not a scientific statement. It is much closer to a religious statement. It is a statement of faith. Darwinian evolution fits within naturalism or theism to a certain extent. So, let's talk about Darwin a little bit. The Darwinian evolution that we know occurs in nature is completely compatible with belief in God and the Bible. We know there is genetic variation within a species. Some giraffes have longer necks than others. Some finches have stronger beaks than others. Sometimes this small variation means that a particular giraffe or a particular finch is more likely to survive and therefore create babies with the same genetic variation. This is Darwinian evolution at its simplest form, and it is perfectly compatible with Christianity, even the Bob Jones type of Christianity. This is a level of Darwinian evolution that we can actually demonstrate in a laboratory with bacteria. Now take it up a level. And this is where Darwin started building on his theory. Maybe these little changes build up enough to create a whole new species. Have we ever seen this happen in nature? Not really. Can we demonstrate it in a lab? No. If a Bob Jones-type Christian believes God made every species exactly as they are today, then we have a conflict with Darwinian evolution. But Billy Graham-type Christians, Wheaton College-type Christians, Fuller Seminary-type Christians don't have a problem with this level of Darwinian evolution either. Now we take it up another level. Does this sort of evolutionary dynamic, tiny changes building up over time, explain where humans came from? Are humans and all other life on Earth related with a common ancestor back there somewhere? This gets a little trickier still theologically. There are some amazingly complex leaps. Self-replicating cells with information encoded inside them. Where did those first cells come from? And what is the source of the language written in their DNA? The leap from simple cells to complex cells. The Cambrian explosion where major new life forms appear seemingly from nothing. The appearance of consciousness. The image of God. All these things defy easy Darwinistic explanation. They seem to imply that something more is at play than just blind chance and millions of years. This is where Billy Graham, Wheaton College-type Christians see God's hand at work. They see his fingerprints in the machinery of nature. This is where Francis Collins sees the language of God written in every cell. He wrote a book with that title. Bob Jones-type Christians have long since left. They don't like this. But Billy Graham-type Christians are wrestling through the evidence, both biblical evidence and scientific evidence, following the wisdom of Francis Bacon, father of the scientific method, who advised us to lay God's two great books side by side, the book of nature and the Bible, and read them together. And we do find tension, but we also find reason to worship our Creator. Of course, there's still one more level of Darwinism, one that says this general Darwinian principle that things will vary and the good ones will be preserved and then become even more complex over time could be applied to the creation of the entire universe. That somehow Darwinian principles could work over billions of years, even outside of biology and DNA. Therefore, we don't need God at all, anywhere. And here, Billy Graham-type Christians recognize this isn't science anymore. We have left the realm of experimentally accessible science and are now in the realm of pure conjecture. We are in the realm of faith. That kind of science isn't in conflict with faith because it is faith. Darwinian evolution explains some things. Science explains some things, but neither explains everything. Many people have tried to work out the differences between science and religion. Stephen Jay Gould, a biologist at Harvard, believes in the concept of non-overlapping magisteria. I told my wife I might actually mention non-overlapping magisteria in my talk, and she said, "Are you sure you're not going in a little too deep?" It was late at night. Magisteria is the teaching authority of the Roman Catholic Church, especially as exercised by bishops and popes. So magisteria is your area of teaching authority. What Stephen Jay Gould proposes is that science and religion have two completely different areas of teaching authority, and they do not overlap at all. Science tells us about the physical world. Religion tells us about morals. Richard Dawkins says that's hooey. The realm of science and the realm of religion completely overlap and are completely in conflict. Richard Dawkins says, God, either he exists or he doesn't. It's a scientific question. One day we may know the answer, and meanwhile we can say something pretty strong about the possibility. There's a third way. There's the biblical view. Science is within what God has created. It is not outside of God. It is not separate from God, and it does not eliminate God. Science is the study of natural phenomena in the natural world. It is the study of mechanisms. It is not the study of agency. Okay, John Lennox describes it this way. If you study a Ford motor car, you could learn all the principles of how a Ford motor car works. The engine, the dynamics, the science, all of that. That doesn't mean there's no Henry Ford necessary. The existence of a Henry Ford and his motives for inventing the Ford motor car are completely different than how the car works. And that's how John Lennox would look at the universe. The universe has principles. We study the principles. That's science. That's completely different than where did those principles come from. And we mentioned Lawrence Krauss, who has tried to explain the existence of the universe with a theory that the universe started out of nothing, but an unsteady quantum energy field that at a very subatomic level had the ability to pop universes into existence like soap bubbles. To which John Lennox says, and where did that come from? There's always another level back. We don't need to fear science. Francis Bacon says God has given us two great books, the book of nature and the Bible. We should read them side by side. And I think that's the theme of the week overall. Almost all of these topics, there is something that we're afraid of. We're afraid of the atheist and the effect he could have on my kids. We're afraid of the other. We're afraid of Black Lives Matter because we don't understand it. We're afraid of science and what could happen if my kids learn that maybe there's a connection between humans and monkeys. What does that mean? Do they lose their faith? There is no need, as children of God, to be afraid of anything. The argument of our lives is more powerful than any argument that could be made against us based on science, based on economics, based on anything. And what our kids look up to much more than our verbal arguments is the argument of our life. What kids want to adopt. I want to be a Christian. Seriously, I want to be a Christian because 8 years ago, Dallas Willard was here, and my mom and I took him to the Nutty Bar stand, and we had an ice cream cone with Dallas Willard. And when you're around somebody like that, he was about 80, just a couple of years before he passed away, who's been walking with Jesus their entire life, they glow. And I want to glow. I am not a Christian because I've heard this really good argument on talk radio. I'm a Christian because I want to be like these saints that I've met. Like Norma Hart, who used to go here for years and years, and was a missionary. And near the end of her life, she would sit down in the front row and just beam. I want to be like that. So, where are we? I want to talk a little bit about the local church, because I just did a talk at my own church. And what is the local church? What role do we play in all of this? Not just science, but the whole week with our kids, with race relations, with atheists next door. What role does the local church play? I'm doing a study for kids based on the book of Ephesians, and some of this comes out of that study. Ephesians 1, 9, and 10 says, God is making known to us the mystery of his will, according to his purpose, which he set forth in Christ as a plan for the fullness of time. Paul is saying over and over again, God has a plan, I'm about to tell it to you. God has a plan, I'm about to tell it to you. God has a will, I'm about to tell you what it is. To unite all things in him. All things in heaven and all things on earth. Other versions of the Bible, this is ESV, other versions say to reconcile all things to himself. This is what we're teaching the kids in this study. What is God's plan? That you don't smoke, that you don't drink, that you only date Christian girls, that you don't listen to rock. No! God's plan is to reconcile all things to himself. What is reconciliation? What does it mean to reconcile? The word means to restore friendly relations. Or to put it another way, to turn enemies into friends. This is God's purpose. This is what God is about. The whole created order, including us, became enemies with God. And he wants us to be friends again. He wants us to be reconciled. He wants us to walk with him. How does he do that? Jesus came for the purpose of reconciliation, reconciling us to God. We are reconciled to God through Christ. But Jesus is no longer actively on earth reconciling people by hand. Okay, Paul says this is now the purpose of his body. His body is us, the church. The purpose of the local church, and this is why, back in the 20s and 30s, some people, why evangelicalism was reborn in America as a third movement was the thought that conservative Christians in the fundamentalist camp had become so concerned about policing their beliefs within their tent so that modernism would creep in, that they stopped working to reconcile God to the world. This is what we're called to do, to turn enemies into friends. It starts in the local church. This is why you cannot Christian alone. You can't go out by yourself and Christian. Because it's about reconciliation. And to be in reconciliation, you have to be in community. It's the local church where we learn to reconcile one with another. Paul talks about Jews and Greeks coming together in the body of Christ. They were enemies. They wouldn't eat with each other. They didn't like each other. Paul says, no, through Christ we have been reconciled one to another. Jew and Greek, male and female, rich and poor, slave and free. The world sees what God wants when he sees reconciliation in the church. And then from there, we reconcile our neighborhoods. We reconcile, I showed you pictures of me going to visit Peter Boghossian in Portland. Okay, technically Portland is not my neighborhood, but Jesus says, who is your neighbor? Everyone you bump into. I bump into Peter Boghossian. I go to his house. We were supposed to be enemies, and God turned us into friends. That's the gospel. That's reconciliation. And when we get together with someone from Black Lives Matter, if we don't agree with that point of view, and we get together with a staunch neo-Darwinist who says Darwinism is the only thing we need to explain the existence of everything, we start out as enemies, but when we stop arguing and break bread together, we become friends. And the world says, how did you do that? Just go in the chat rooms online. The world is not good at reconciling. Watch the news. The world is not good at reconciling. What got the world's attention, the Roman world's attention, in the first century was the church, during a plague, not simply taking care of its own people, but taking care of everybody's people. Friends, enemies, Greek, Jew, slave-free, man, woman, Mother Teresa going to Calcutta, and taking care of the people that you weren't supposed to take care of, because they were untouchable. You can't take care of those people. That's not what Jesus said. And the whole world went, oh wow, look at that tiny woman. Taking care of everyone. Anything we've talked about this week is solved when we turn enemies into friends. When we reconcile. And that starts with the local church. And it starts with us reconciling with each other first. It's funny because the reason I did this study is I was trying to figure out why so much of what Paul says, so much of his instructions, be nice, be kind, be this, be that, be a good person, do all this, when you back up and look at the context, almost probably 95% of the time, he's not talking about how Christians are supposed to relate to the world. He's talking about Christians that are supposed to relate to other Christians. It says, in the body of Christ, treat each other this way. Treat each other this way. Treat each other this way. Well, what about the world? The world is drawn to Christ by seeing how we treat each other. And how we treat each other then can't help but spill out. Paul knew that if Christians couldn't reconcile with one another, nothing else mattered. Doesn't matter what your apologetics are. Doesn't matter if you can go to Mars Hill and give a great speech about some lost God. None of that matters if they look at the church and say, well, you guys can't even get along. Why would I? What's the point? So, purpose of the local church is reconciliation. First and foremost, one to another. To be in a community with people that you normally would not choose to be friends with. And to become one as a community, to live in one accord. And then to let that reconciliation spill over everyone else you meet. The atheist, the LGBT activist, whoever you meet, if they're struck first by your concern for them as opposed to your argument against them. Arguing against is not reconciling. Concern is reconciling and then creates opportunity to explain your beliefs and why. Anyway, we got 17 more minutes. That's actually what I want to say about the local church. I think because we have media and it's so easy to reach the world without needing a local church. I can be a TV pastor and I don't actually have to do the dirty work of having people in the congregation. I can listen to podcasts of great sermons and I don't actually have to do the dirty work of sitting next to someone who's kind of smelly to listen to a service. We can use electronic media to attempt to Christian alone. Even in ministry. I can write videos and then just toss them to the internet. Woo! And never actually meet anybody. You can't Christian alone. There is nothing compelling to the world about me sitting by myself talking to a video camera. I have to get in the community. And that's where the local church. That's the local church. That's the local church. I mean, if the atheists in my town are amazed, we had Kevin Palau on our podcast recently, and as part of rethinking how his father's Luis Palau, he's preached to like 500 million people around the world. Crusades. When they had to rethink crusades, they're in Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon is not a terribly faith-friendly place to be. It's where my friend Pete lives. When they had to rethink crusades, they decided what it would start with churches coming together and then reaching out to the leadership of the city they were going to and saying, how can we help you? And they tried it first in Portland. And the mayor, who's an openly gay mayor, who assumed conservative Christians hate him, was stunned when a whole bunch of Christian church leaders came to his office and said, how can we help you in the city of Portland? And he said, well, we're really struggling with some of our schools. And they came up with a plan to say, okay, we're going to have like 5 churches adopt each one of these schools and just come in and clean them up. You know, do work, do whatever it takes. Paint them, help kids, tutor. And groups of churches adopted schools. And Kevin Palau, a conservative evangelical Christian, and the homosexual activist mayor of Portland became good friends. And Portland had to go, oh, what the Christians are doing. They're not only taking care of their own people, they're taking care of our people, just like in the first century. That's the purpose of the church. Okay, so we talked about a lot of things. Questions about today. I'm not, if you are really into creation science, and I have a lot of people listening to our podcast who just kind of love some of that stuff that maybe, the flood explains everything, that's fine. That's fine. It is not essential. It is not essential. And unfortunately, in too many churches, we're making it essential, and we're driving people away from the gospel when we tell them that Jesus comes with alternate science. And if you don't accept the alternate science, you can't accept Jesus. So, yeah, if you want to, take a field trip to the Creation Museum, that's fine. I'm not against that. But I wanted to unpack, have Christians always believed that? No. Augustine had no problem with the notion that the world was old or young. He didn't think Genesis 1 was literal 24-hour days. He thought God probably created everything all at once. That was 300 AD. That was a long time before Darwin. So, questions? I know that was a big mess of stuff. Okay, good night. See you later. Oh, seriously, you have questions. You want to ask them? Yes?
Okay, enhance videos that show you that something slow, it almost scares you.
Yes.
Hold to this, otherwise it's like, and my family and my church
Yeah.
to this place where we don't really hold to.
Yeah. Yeah. Ken Ham's videos, and he's a wonderful communicator and has done a wonderful job getting a message out very broadly through first the fundamentalist church, but now there's no longer a fundamentalist church, pretty much the whole evangelical
What's the question?
church. The question was, his videos always talk about a slippery slope. And if we give up this point on the Bible, then eventually, there was a picture of the slippery slope. It's like, well, if you give up inerrancy, then the next thing is virgin birth, and the next thing. Everyone uses that argument. Abortion rights activists use that argument. If we give up on late-term abortion, then the next thing is we're going to give up on this, and the next thing is we're going to give up on this. One of the questions you have to ask, and John Walton can speak about this much better, is what are we giving up on specifically? Ken Ham would say we're giving up on taking Genesis seriously. John Walton would say, and I'm speaking for him while he's staring at me, so that's fine. John Walton would say, no, we're actually taking Genesis more seriously than you are, because we're going back to the ancient the original audience and the original author to say, not how does this strike us, but how would this have struck them? The authority of Scripture is in the relationship between the original author and the original listener, neither of which is us. So that's where we get, like, for example, to come out with a literal 7-day physical creation out of Genesis 1 is to assume ancient Israelites were wondering about physical creation. Ancient people never thought of creation in terms of material. They thought of creation in terms of function. In particular, the Bible doesn't actually start with nothing. It starts with water. Water in the ancient world was a symbol of disorder or unorder, of chaos. So there's no sea in Revelation when we get to the city. There's no sea, not because God doesn't like surfing, because the sea was a symbol of chaos in the ancient world. So no sea is another way of saying all chaos, all disorder is now done. Yep. So I would honestly say, pick up Walton's book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, because even very staunch young Earth creationists have kind of had to say, that's a really good point. And if in fact Genesis 1 isn't about material creation, if it's about functional creation, then it's just, this whole battle is unnecessary. Does that make sense?
I guess I just still get this that will we start lie or colleges where people start saying it's the Bible's all symbolism and
Well, here's a question.
lie.
When you go to church on Sunday, are you married?
Yes.
Okay. Do you cover your head?
No.
The Bible says if you're married, you should cover your head in church. The question is, why don't you? Because we've learned enough about the context of that statement to know that statement probably is referring to a different culture in a different time. First century Roman Empire, where a wife covering her head was a symbol that she was married. It's the equivalent of a wedding. So the question really being asked of Paul was, when I go to church, should I keep my wedding ring on? And the answer was yes. Out of respect for your husband, keep your wedding ring on. So you don't cover your head when you go to church. Men are told to never pray with their heads covered. Never. Never pray with a hat on. Ever. I pray with a hat on. Why? Because in the ancient world, the first century Roman Empire, pagans would flip, to pray to the gods, would flip a fold of their toga up over their head. And that was something you did in pagan prayer. As Paul's saying, no, that's pagan, don't do that. So, because we have study Bibles, and now there are Christian denominations where women do cover their heads. Because we have study Bibles, we can say, oh, okay, so that's probably more about a culture, and what he's really saying, he's not saying women are forbidden to wear gold jewelry, he's saying, present yourself modestly, and also make sure you don't look like a temple prostitute, because temple prostitution was a huge thing in the ancient world. Yeah, so we're reading behind, because the Bible was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. I'm sorry, it was written to us, it wasn't written, no, it was written for us, not to us. Yes, I said that right, thank you. Paul didn't write the letter of Timothy to me, he wrote it to Timothy. So for me to understand that letter, I need to know some context of who was Timothy, what was his life like, where did he live, and what were the issues he was facing. And then I can read Timothy. I can read the Psalms better if I understand a little about, ancient sheep herding, for example. So I can read Genesis better if I learn how ancient people thought about creation. And I remember this is a creation account that was written for ancient people to apply to their lives. And again, John Walton can get up and talk about this for. He did a whole class on this. He did a whole 5-day class on this here 7 or 8 years ago. 2010. Yeah, and that's, again, so, pick up his book, Lost World of Genesis 1. Because it's highly selective when you say, if you give up on the idea that Adam was made from literal dust, you've given up the Bible. But you don't say, if you give up on the idea that all women should have their heads covered in church, you're giving up the Bible. So you need to justify why this, not this. Why I don't have to eat pork. I don't have to not eat pork anymore. Let's understand why. There's a Christian website where people ask questions, and then the crowd answers them. One of the questions was, is it a sin to get a tattoo? I need to know, if I want to get a tattoo, but I'm afraid it might be a sin. 3 out of the 5 responders said, yes, it is a sin to get a tattoo. Pat Robertson on TV said it is absolutely a sin to get a tattoo. Even, he said, if it's the face of Jesus tattooed on you like Justin Bieber just did on his calf. Still a sin. Why do they say that? Because in Exodus it says don't make markings on your body. Anyone here have a tattoo? Yeah, because we need to do more than just read the Bible. We need to understand what we're reading. And I think you can find some really good stuff on Genesis that will help. The slippery slope, again, everyone uses it, from Democrats who say don't compromise with Republicans, to Republicans who say don't compromise with Democrats, to pro-abortion activists who say don't compromise with pro-lifers. The question is, what's the principle behind why you're reading something differently? What's the principle behind, the Bible says the earth cannot move. The earth is unmovable. That argument was used against Galileo when he said, I think the earth goes around the sun. And some people said, no, the Bible says the earth is unmovable. If I give up on that, slippery slope. What am I going to give up on next? So it's not just about, I have to stop here because that could lead to something else and something else and something else. It's about, what's the principle behind why I think this is this way, and is that principle of biblical interpretation correct? It's hard work, but it's worth doing if we take the Bible seriously. And the question isn't, do you take the Bible literally? The question is, do you take the Bible seriously? Because parts of it aren't literal. It's full of poetry. It's full, it says God has wings. It says God's a chicken. It says God has feathers. He covers Israel with his feathers. Oh, that's weird. God has feathers. Does that make sense? A little bit of sense? Go find John Walton after this. Do you have copies of Genesis 1?
Not here.
Dude. Okay. Dean Bruns. Oh, no. Oh, over there? Oh, okay. Hi.
Are you familiar with the Iowa robocalls, and do you have any comments on? If you do a Google search and type in robocalls, you can listen to the Iowa robocalls.
Iowa robocalls. Do you know what that is? Was it the sequel to RoboCop?
Well, they made the news back during the Trump election.
Yeah, I've heard of it. I don't know exactly. I'm not familiar.
Oh, well, I can essentially. Well, I encourage you to listen to it, but they call, for like a quarter of a cent, you can call thousands of people, and they called all these people, and they said, hey, 100 years ago, 35%, this kind of goes in with that, we don't have any enemies. Well, they're we have enemies. They said, well, 100 years ago, 35% of the people on the planet were Caucasian, and today 90% is. And they say, well, when there's no longer a white majority, essentially, we're going to go back to the jungle or whatever. And,
Well, that's nice. It's not too racist.
Well, this kind of, you say, we don't have any enemies. Well,
Yeah.
the other thing, we have enemies, and who's doing this to the Caucasian race? Are they doing it themselves with pathological?
Yeah. We do, and that's trying to get your objective by generating a fear. It's so much easier, and we do it too. Atheists are coming for your children, and they're probably going to eat them. Darwinists are coming for your children. Democrats are coming for your children. And they do it on the other side. Conservative Christians are coming for your children. They want to take over the schools. And I read there was a novel called Christian Nation, which is a novel. It's someone's account of what America would become if conservative Christians actually got their way, which includes the bombing of San Francisco to kill all the homosexuals, which includes taking atheists and putting them in reprogramming camps where they're tortured until they convert to Christianity. And the funny thing is that the reviewers, think, oh, this is a really scary vision of what Christians actually want. And everybody does it. Here's why you should be afraid, and therefore give me your support. And we just need to make sure we don't fall into that trap. Don't lead with love. If you don't do it my way, you're going to go to hell. Yeah, that's effective.
Yeah.
It is effective, especially if you're 12 and under. Rob?
This was a really good presentation, but I think everybody's wondering, do you have any handouts?
Do I have any handouts? No, Rob. The good news is there's a guy videotaping those, so you can get a copy of it somehow. One more minute. Any questions for Rob on any of his stuff?
I just wonder, would you agree that the best thing for a Christian to give up on is sin?
It's the best thing for a Christian to give up on sin. Yeah, I think it would be hard to disagree with that. Yeah. Again, I'm not, in on the science stuff. What I would like to do more than anything else, this is what Francis Collins is trying to do, is just defuse the tension and the assumption, almost a knee-jerk assumption, that we have to oppose science because they're coming to take the Bible away. And you can't find quotes from people that actually want to do just that, but you can also find quotes from Christians that actually do want to take homosexuals and lock them up. So you've got to avoid taking the most extreme position any atheist has ever made or any Christian has ever made and then painting it across all of them. Most Christians, because I've had people who say, well, when scientists say the earth is old, they're only saying that because they want us to stop believing in God. Most scientists don't care if you believe in God. They're studying the world and trying to figure out what their commission is, which is about this wide, and it involves, this one turtle and how it evolved and how it's connected to this other turtle. Are they doing that study to disprove God? They don't give a rip. They love turtles. And so you kind of have to give them the benefit of the doubt. Yes, you, and then you.
One thing that I've heard a lot of Christian scientists, especially Collins and others, say is that every new scientific discovery really leads to a fuller understanding of the nature of God and God's creation. I didn't hear you say that.
Yeah, every new scientific discovery leads to a fuller understanding of God and His creation. That's very true. One thing, and I try to teach my kids to do this, develop the ability to discern when a scientist is making a non-scientific statement. When you say, I'm like Carl Sagan, the cosmos is full of wonderful science. But he starts out by saying the cosmos is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be. That's not science. So just to be able to call that out, say, I can completely ignore what you just said because you're speaking outside your area of expertise. That was a statement of philosophy. And you're not a philosopher. You're a scientist. Get back on the science. And some, like theoretical physics, can get so far away from anything that's demonstrable or experimentally supported that some people view theoretical physics as getting more into religion than science. And it's okay to say, that's fine, fun theory, doesn't threaten me at all. Just keep thinking your crazy thoughts. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I was just going to make an observation or a statement based on just this entire class this week, is that, there's a call for us as believers to, when we're, the questions that we've been asked about discrimination and how we respond to our culture versus looking at it, like this, like through a shaded window, but just looking at it, the whole picture, and that call for us to do all that you guys have talked about that this week. It really puts a believer, I don't want to say isolated, but into this, well, you're a different kind of Christian. You look like you are liberal because you are associated with, you're opening your home to people who are doing drugs, selling drugs, who don't look like you, who smell bad.
Right.
And,
in other words, you're starting to look like Jesus.
right, and so
And he might have been a little out there.
You get flagged from believers
Yeah.
because you look like Jesus.
You get flack from believers because you're hanging out with the wrong people.
Right, or you don't take.
You're in good company.
Yeah.
So did Jesus.
Yeah, and I think maybe we should be more willing to keep going that way versus to stick with what's comfortable.
Yeah. Comfort zone. John.
6 copies of Genesis 1 over.
Oh, if you're interested, they do have 6 copies of John's book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, over in the bookstore, which Francis Collins said is an amazingly important book on Genesis, and I highly recommend it. Okay, thank you guys. It's been a great week. Rob, you want to say anything? Okay.